So, as we kind of began talking about last year, we started off in the book of Daniel as a precursor to getting into Revelation because we wanted to lay some foundation going into things. And then we took the break at Christmas time to look at the prophecies concerning Christ in the book of Isaiah. And then at the first of the year, we jumped to Revelation. And we got up through chapter 5. And then last week, we jumped back to Daniel so that we can begin to lay some more foundation for the rest of our look at Revelation. And if you remember, we talked about last week that in that particular vision which had the lion and the bear and the leopard and the great beast, that even though none of the nations was listed by name, that it seems to compare with the image that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in his dream. And that it's probably relatively safe to, if we want to try and figure out who the kingdoms are, that we could start with what Daniel knows. And that would have been that the first kingdom, the lion with wings, would have been Babylon. And that would have been something he would have been very familiar with. And so what we've been doing then is transitioning into the apocalyptic section of Daniel in this process. And like we said, Daniel would have been familiar with that lion image. As a matter of fact, if you would, this lion image with the wings, with the head of the king, stood to guard the entrance of Babylon. There was one on each side of the entrance. So he would have been familiar with that word picture that was in that vision, that the lion with the wings. And he would have understood that to be Babylon. And so, like I said, Babylon is the only kingdom we can truly identify, even though the three that follow do seem to fit the prophecy. And what few details are there. And one of the things we try to do is let the Bible interpret the prophecy if an interpretation is given, and don't add to it or take away from it. And so, all of the details that are important to the prophecy will be given. And so don't try to assume more than is there. So even though we looked at that and we try to say, well, yeah, these kingdoms kind of fit in there, they seem to fit, we weren't given the names of the kingdoms. And so understanding which kingdoms were literally being talked about wasn't important to the prophecy, which is what we looked at. And so remember, we have stepped back in time to the reign of Belshazzar with the last week's look at chapter 7 of Daniel. And so let's get into this week, and we pick up in verse 1 of chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. And as I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power the large horn was broken off. And in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." So, we have gone from a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a horrific beast with no animal counterpart to a ram and a goat. The picture is not of a domesticated sheep or a goat, but rather we are still looking at wild animals in this vision. And what we are seeing so far in this vision is consistent with Daniel's previous vision, and that is, if you would, this is a picture of kingdoms rising and falling violently. The ram is seemingly unbeatable until suddenly a goat with only one horn comes on the scene. And now the goat is unbeatable. It is injured but seems to recover from the injury stronger than before. But that's really what's happening. I mean, if we were to have only these first 14 verses, we could come up with all kinds of speculation very easily. I mean, what we've seen so far in Daniel could lead us to believe that the ram is Babylon again. I mean, after all, hasn't that always been what was listed first, both in the statue of chapter 2 and the beasts of chapter 7? And also, didn't Belshazzar reign as co-regent with his father? The two horns, the father and son reigning? But we have a few clues given in these opening verses. We have horns again, and strange things happening with them. We have the 2,300 evenings and mornings. Well, what's that all about? Well, we'll look at it a little bit. And then there's the reconsecration of the temple. But can we really understand the prophecy with only these clues? No. We need more information in order to gain an accurate understanding of what God is telling us, as well as Daniel and the exiles. And thankfully, Daniel was given the interpretation of the vision, which gives us a foundation to investigate the clues that are found in the first verses. And this prophecy has a more detailed interpretation than the previous vision. So we're going to be given the names, which make this a more focused prophecy. It's going to tell us exactly who the kingdoms are. So let's find out what the interpretation is so that we can rightly investigate the clues we have been given in the proper context. And remember, pay close attention to what it actually says. Okay? We have a tendency to, like we've talked about before, we have a tendency to approach Scripture with things that we've been told along the way, things that we've come to believe, and so many times we find ourselves believing something is in there that's not there. Or there's a word in there that changes the meaning of everything that we've kept missing along the way. And so, pay attention closely to what is actually there. Picking up at verse 15. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause outstanding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business, and I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So this vision is significant in a couple of ways because it has two distinct applications for Daniel and the exiles. Let's look at the ram. Let's go back to the first verse, if you would. First verse, chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In the 3rd year of whose reign? If you would, Belshazzar. We're still in his reign. The 3rd year would have put this in the year 549 BC. And this vision is preparing Daniel for another set of events that will begin to happen 10 years later. Belshazzar will be giving a feast when suddenly there's a hand writing a message on the wall. And eventually Daniel will be called to interpret the handwriting. The writing was Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, which means, if you would, Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The Medes and Persians had been making their way toward Babylon. They were eventually at the front gate, literally. And Daniel knew exactly what was about to happen, not only because he could read the message and knew what it meant, but also, if you would, because of his vision he had 10 years before. Daniel knew what was about to happen when he was called to go to the king. And it was confirmed by the writing on the wall. And if you would, that night, Babylon fell to the ram of Daniel's vision from 10 years earlier. And now, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. The ram, or the Medo-Persian Empire, they ruled for about 200 years. But notice, the Medo-Persian Empire comes onto the scene in Daniel's vision and just as quickly disappears. In other words, the events during that period, though there are many events that affected the Jews during that period, are not significant to what God is telling Daniel and the exiles in this particular vision. Okay? They come onto the scene, the vision says, here they are, and there they go. And everything in between doesn't matter to this particular vision. It is the period after the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire that is the focus. And so we don't need to dwell on the ram. It is simply there to provide a context for the prophecy so that we understand the flow of what's going on. It tells the exiles what to watch for, and it tells us where in history to look back to. Why is that important? Well, let's go back to Daniel 8:17, if you would. As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand, the vision concerns the time of the end. Where have we talked about that before? Revelation. And remember, it says, if you would, the time of the end, not the end of time, like we've talked about before. That the time of the end is a period of time, a long period of time, and we talked about when it began. So Gabriel told Daniel what the focus of the vision is, and then he repeated it again in verse 19, if you would. He said, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. In other words, this vision's purpose is to provide information concerning the time of the end. This is the important focus. Whatever else anyone may try to pull out of this has got to be focused on that one thing, the time of the end. So let's break down the key elements and clues now that we have a context with which we can gain understanding. Let's go back to verse 5, if you would. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. And the interpretation tells us that the goat is Greece. We don't have to guess about it. It's there. The goat is Greece. And with our knowledge of the rise and fall of the Greek Empire, we can figure out the meaning of the horns. The prominent horn between the eyes would be, if you would, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquers the Medo-Persian Empire and continues to expand his empire. The Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, easy for me to say, looks like this, if you would. This is the Greek Empire. Huge. But in the vision we are told, if you would, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So, Alexander came to power at the age of 20 when his father was assassinated in 336 BC. Initially, he shared the throne with his sister, but was given complete rule in 335 BC after a few successful military campaigns. His reign was short-lived. He died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in 323 BC. Cause of death is open to speculation, but most agree he was probably poisoned. He was 32 and was at the height of his glory as the king of the Greek Empire. He had no heir to the throne. So, eventually the empire was divided between 4 of his generals after a lot of positioning and warring among those generals and others. Remember the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea from last week that we talked about? And we have it mentioned here again. The 4 heavens. The picture that kingdoms rise and fall, and it's turbulent. It's violent. That kings just don't randomly give up power because they feel like they need to give it to somebody else. And so, if you would, the 4 kingdoms. And so it started out trying to be divided amongst several others as well, but it ended up under these 4. The first, if you would, Cassander had Macedonia, if you would. Okay. Then Lysimachus, if you would, had Pergamum. We're familiar with that. Later called Thrace. And then if you would, Ptolemy is in Egypt and has the area of Ionia up near Pergamum. But then we have Seleucus, if you would, in Mesopotamia and Central Asia. It is from the Seleucid kingdom that the next verses come from and are a direct reference to. Let's look at verses 23 through 25. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Antiochus Epiphanes was a member of the Greek Seleucid dynasty and was the son and potential successor of Antiochus III the Great. Because of that, he became a political hostage of the Roman Republic following the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC. His older brother, which would be the first one in line for the throne, Seleucus IV Philopator, followed his father onto the throne in 187 BC, and Antiochus was exchanged for his nephew Demetrius I Soter, the son and heir of Seleucus. After this, Antiochus lived in Athens and was there when his brother was assassinated in 175 BC. Seleucus was assassinated in September of that year by the government minister Heliodorus. Heliodorus proclaimed himself regent afterward, essentially giving himself control of the government. And this arrangement did not last long. With the help, now remember the scripture said he was going to come to power, not by his own power, he was going to have help. With the help of King Eumenes II of Pergamum, Antiochus traveled from Athens through Asia Minor and reached Syria by November of that year. And Seleucus' legitimate heir, Demetrius I Soter, was still hostage in Rome. So Antiochus Epiphanes seized the throne for himself, proclaiming himself co-regent with another son of Seleucus, an infant named Antiochus. Antiochus, son of Seleucus IV, would later die in 170 BC, and it is suspected he was murdered by Antiochus Epiphanes. Through a lot of maneuvering and with help from others, Antiochus Epiphanes came to power and began to Hellenize his kingdom by forcing idolatry on his subjects. The major clash with the Jews began when Antiochus deposed the true high priest Onias and replaced him with his brother Jason, a Hellenist Jew, who was sympathetic to Antiochus but still of the tribe of Levi. Now we come to the 2300 evenings and mornings. We are told that when the persecution began, it would be 2300 evenings and mornings until the temple was reconsecrated. The fact that it is listed as evenings and mornings tell us that this is literal days, not figurative days like time, and half times. So, if you would, 2300 evenings and mornings equals about 6 years and 4 months. The temple was reconsecrated in 165 BC, sometime during what we now consider to be November to December. It varies based on the Jewish calendar. Now, go back in time 6 years and 4 months, and we find ourselves at 172 BC. If you would. This is the year that Jason the high priest, who was the last descendant of the Levite high priest Zadok to serve as high priest, was deposed by Antiochus Epiphanes and replaced with Menelaus from the tribe of Benjamin. Antiochus removed the Levites from the priesthood and put a Benjamite in charge. It is also the year that the intense persecution of the Jews began to escalate. Von Elliot writes, Antiochus Epiphanes went too far. He outlawed circumcision and Sabbath keeping. He demanded idolatry and eating swine. He replaced God's Levitical high priest with a Benjamite. In Jerusalem, he built a heathen altar on top of God's altar. He ripped and burned all of the holy scriptures he could find. When Antiochus officials came to the city of Modin to force heathen sacrifices, the priest Mattathias refused. At that moment, a Jew came forward to sacrifice, whereupon Mattathias rushed to slay him upon the altar. The king's officers were next slain, and the heathen altar torn down. Interestingly, the book of Maccabees compares Mattathias' zeal to that of Phinehas in Numbers 25. Mattathias and his sons, including Judas Maccabeus, now fled to the mountains. The resistance had begun. Elsewhere, the king's men tried to force an aged scribe, Eleazar, to eat swine's flesh or face death. When he refused, his friends tried to persuade him to save his life by providing his own clean meat and making it look like he was eating the heathen sacrifice. But the 90-year-old saint refused such hypocrisy. He did not want to give a bad example to the young believers who would think he had left the faith. He also knew he could escape the punishment of Antiochus, but could not escape the hands of the Almighty. He bravely went to his death. Then there were 7 brothers and their mother who chose death rather than disobey God's law against eating unclean meat. Antiochus had the tongue of the first cut out, then his extremities cut off, and his trunk thrown into a frying pan, while his mother and brothers looked on and exhorted one another to die valiantly. One by one, the brothers were tortured and murdered. When the youngest was left, Antiochus promised him wealth and position if he would turn from the laws of his fathers. Antiochus also called upon the mother to exhort her son to save his life. The mother rather exhorted her son to have no fear of this tormentor, but rather to trust in the Creator. Whereupon the youth accepted his death, and last of all, the mother was slain. Such was the amazing faith of some of the Jews in the 2nd century before Christ. It was a dreadful time in Israel, but Daniel had predicted that a little horn, who we know today was Antiochus, would take away the daily sacrifice and cast God's sanctuary and truth to the ground. For a while, it looked like he might triumph. However, because of such great men, women, and youth of faith, with God as their helper, Daniel could also predict, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And when was it cleansed? If you would. A little over 6 years later, 2,300 evenings and mornings after the Levitical high priest was deposed and replaced with a Benjamite. This reconsecration of the temple is what is known as Hanukkah today. In the New Testament, it was, if you would, the festival of dedication, which Jesus attended in John chapter 10. Verse 25 of Daniel 8, we read, if you would. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Antiochus was continually scheming and was excessively arrogant. Scripture says, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. In other words, he was not going to be overthrown by another king or assassinated by someone in the government. He died of disease in 164 BC, approximately 1 year after the temple was reconsecrated. Various religious explanations exist of Antiochus' death. Apparently, he attacked a temple of the Mesopotamian deity Nanaya in Persia shortly before his demise, and his death was possibly attributed to impiety and punishment by Nanaya in some quarters. Jewish sources gave credit to Antiochus' death to his earlier impiety at the temple in Jerusalem. According to 2 Maccabees, he died from divinely inflicted disease. And as is recorded in 2 Maccabees, but the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he stopped speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures. And that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange inflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews, and giving orders to drive even faster. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus, he who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea, and had imagined that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms, and while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. And because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. So what is the significance of all of this? Remember the key statements when Gabriel tells us the purpose of this prophecy and the particular details, that to understand that the vision concerns the time of the end? And then it was repeated again in verse 19. Did you catch that? We've said it many times, if you would. Time of the end. These events are crucial because they were to be a sign to the Jews when they happened that, if you would, the time of the end was close, which meant the time for the Messiah to come was close. You know, one of the interesting things is, and I'll probably touch on this again next week, is that today we got people trying to figure out when Christ is going to return. And the Bible specifically says no one knows. And so why are we trying to figure out what the Bible's already said? We don't know. But yet, when he was to come the first time, God gave very specific information. See, everything from Daniel 7 to the end of Daniel is a progression. And if you would, in each vision, we are given more information that was intended to give the Jews what they needed to identify the Messiah. So that when he arrived on the scene, there should be no excuse. And not only was it to help them identify them, but to ensure that they would be watching for him, waiting for him to come. God has already been telling them there isn't going to be peace when the exile is over. Okay, we looked at that last week. The vision was basically, there's not going to be peace. Kingdoms are going to rise, kingdoms are going to fall, the violence is going to be there, there's going to be turmoil until the end. God's people are still going to be hated and persecuted and killed. But don't give up. Remain faithful. The Messiah will be coming soon. And here are the things that you need to understand so that you will recognize him. These prophecies concerning when the Messiah would come the first time, and when the end of time would begin, or the time of the end would begin, were there so that they wouldn't miss it. The vision is saying, if you would, this is what is going to happen, and when it does, be alert. Because if you would, the Messiah will be arriving soon. But they missed it. They didn't understand the prophecies of Isaiah, and they were expecting a warring Messiah that would come on the scene with an army and overthrow their oppressors and rule a physical geopolitical kingdom. And as a result, they rallied behind every would-be Messiah that raised an army and began a resistance, hoping that he was the one they were waiting for. Not only that, they missed the signs that his arrival was near. It's interesting, we get into the New Testament and we look at the New Testament account of Jesus' birth, and the only ones that seem to be looking for it were magi. All of this information that is being given to tell the Jews that this is a sign, get ready, start watching. And it's the magi in a foreign land that are the ones doing the watching, and not the people that the prophecy was intended for. Like I said, everything is progression through the rest of Daniel. And next week we will begin to see just how much detail was given to the Jews as to when the Messiah would arrive. Like I said, there's so much detail that they were without excuse for missing it. And we talked early on that, if the detail's not there, don't try and put it in where it doesn't belong. Look at what the focus of the prophecy is, but as the prophecies begin to progress, we begin to see more detail as the focus begins to home in on the time of the end, on the arrival of the Messiah. And when the events that we see in Revelation begin to take place. The message to Daniel and the exiles was, in the meantime, resolve to be faithful. Resolve to stand firm. Understand that, yes, there is going to come a time before the Messiah comes and when things are going to get really nasty. As a matter of fact, during that period of time, idolatry under Antiochus Epiphanes was the law. You were required to participate or die. You couldn't be just a neutral. You couldn't approach it and say, well, I don't really actually follow the God of the Jews. I don't really follow any God. Antiochus would say either you follow my God, the gods I serve, or you die. The altar he built in Jerusalem on top of the altar of God was to Zeus. Oh, we talked about that in Revelation too. Imagine living at a time when not only is your religion outlawed, you are required to be a part of another religion. You can't be anti-religion. You're either this religion and die, or you're this religion and you live. No in between. Such was life under Antiochus Epiphanes. And thousands of Jews lost their lives because they refused to disobey God and serve idols. But yet they struggled with the same thing that the churches in Revelation struggled with, and that was there were those that compromised. So they were known as the Hellenistic Jews. They kind of embraced those things, and they approached it from the standpoint, well, it's okay, as long as in our hearts we don't really mean it. But those who would stand firm faced death. We're living in a time now where the Scriptures don't give us the details that were there for his first coming. But we know at some point Christ will return. We know, according to Scriptures, that kingdoms are going to rise and fall, that this world is going to continue to be violent and filled with turmoil. The call for us today is pretty much the same as with the Jews of this time. Resolved to remain faithful, regardless of what's going on around us. Remain faithful. Because, like the 90-year-old gentleman that we read about, who understood that he might be able to escape Antiochus, but he can't escape God. It's true for us today. Can't escape God. We all are going to stand before him and give an account. Remain faithful. As we prepare to close, I would encourage you to remain faithful. I think it's pretty evident as we look around where these things kind of go with an ebb and flow. Sometimes it's real bad, sometimes it's real good, and back and forth. We're kind of heading towards the real bad right now. Remain faithful.